Hi, everyone. It's Dan Albus, Member of Parliament for Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola. Part of my role in Parliament is I serve in Aaron O'Toole's shadow cabinet as the shadow minister for the environment and climate change. So part of my time I spend speaking to different stakeholders, different environmental organizations, companies that work in the clean tech space to find out what they're up to, what they think is important. So I'm really pleased today that we have Bob Stelzer from Safety Power out of Ontario. Bob, thanks so much for coming here today. I'd like to just start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your company and all the great things that you're doing at Safety Power.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. I'm chairman and CTO here at Safety Power. We've been in business since 2005. We're located in Ontario, and really over the past 15 years, we've carved out a niche. And we're part of an overall cluster in Ontario that has a very, very strong technology as it relates to air emissions control, particularly when applied to large-scale engines that are used for power generation. So over the years, we've worked very closely with some of the great universities that we have close by to our facility, University of Waterloo, University of Toronto. And in turn, we've hired the graduates from those programs. And together with that team of people, it's a very young team, we have created a really class-leading, world-beating technology when it comes to air emissions control for the power generation sector as it relates to engines.
Wow. So essentially, you're developing technology to keep our skies clean of smog and whatnot?
Absolutely. So around most major cities in Canada and in the United States, which is a very important market for us, you'll see that brown haze that characterizes most of these cities on a nice clear day, and that brown haze is based on NOx, nitrogen oxides, and our technology removes between 95 and 97% of those NOx molecules that create that smog that characterizes, unfortunately, many large cities, not just in North America, of course, throughout the world.
Well, it's amazing the work that you do and also the amount of employment that you offer. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you was in regards to some new regulations that have come out in Ottawa that are going to come into force in June. So let me just give the name of the regulations. So the regulations called off-road compression ignition, mobile and stationary, and large spark ignition engine emission regulations. Now that's a big mouthful. Could you tell us a little bit about these regulations and how they'll affect Safety Power?
Yeah, so these regulations are intended, of course, to ensure that Canadians have the clean air that they deserve. Unfortunately, and in many ways they accomplish that. One unfortunate outcome of these regulations is they capture the power generation sector, which is the sector that companies like Safety Power and the cluster of companies in Ontario, similar to ourselves, that supply solutions. And the unfortunate outcome of these regulations as it relates to power generation is that it will make it impossible for us to sell into our home country, which is very regrettable, and that's certainly deeply concerning to us, deeply concerning our supply chain. Of course, our manufacturing is all done in Ontario. We have both precision fabrication for our injectors and large scale fabrication for the reactors. So this is of deep concern, not just to us, to the cluster of companies like us, to our employees, but also to the broader supply chain that exists to serve companies like ours, which is all Canadian based. So it will certainly have a negative impact on employment, and it's really a bit disheartening because we've been serving this Canadian market really since our inception.
So, a Canadian company employing high-paying wages and jobs right here in Canada. New regulations come forward. Now, obviously, as you said, these regulations are probably designed, to have an overall good public effect. But if they're designed improperly, or without understanding the unintended consequences, that has real impacts in other areas, and that's why we're speaking today. So, what? Maybe let's dive a little bit deeper into this. So, what is at the heart? What things will you not be able to do that will cause big impacts to your operations?
So we'll no longer be able to, but maybe a little bit of history as to how we got here, just very briefly. So the reason this cluster of companies like Safety Power and some of our very competent Canadian competitors exists at all is because in 2011, Ontario put in place some quite stringent emissions requirements. And these are very much intended, as are the federal regulations, to protect the health of Canadians when it comes to the air they breathe. And those strict requirements basically ended up creating this cluster of companies to serve these regulations. And so that was really good regulation in the sense that it was both tough, of great environmental benefit to Canadians, and also had the effect of leveraging Canadian ingenuity to deal with these regulations. And they've been in place, as I said, since 2011 for a 10-year period. So it's really taken, about 10 years to build up this cluster. Now, good regulation can build up a cluster. It takes a decade, as has been the case in our cluster. But regulation which negatively impacts a cluster can destroy that cluster within a year. So it takes a long time in the clean tech sector to build up an export-oriented companies like ours that generates significant export revenues. The world's largest companies, I'm not permitted by NDAs to mention them, but they're companies that every one of us uses every working day on our laptops, on our network systems. These are all in our social networks. These are all companies that are customers of Safety Power and our competitors. And so, good regulation, as was shown in 2011, creates a cluster. Regulation that is not really carefully considered can accidentally damage a cluster. And that's the concern that we face. I think the overall federal regulation, well-intentioned, will have some positive outcomes, but when it comes to power generation, is going to destroy the Canadian market for this cluster.
That's really unfortunate because you said already that there are regulations provincially that you're meeting. And in fact, it's my understanding that they're actually a higher standard than what the federal one offers. And
Yes,
yet one builds up an industry here in Canada and the other one sounds like it's threatening it. Is that the case?
that is indeed the case. So the Ontario regulations were purposely made, I would call them, stretch goals that were put in place. And they were quite carefully considered, and they have been met. We have many examples, literally hundreds of examples of how these Ontario regulations are met. The federal regulations very closely mirror the US EPA regulations, which kind of set a minimum standard for Americans. And so they're not as stringent, for example, as the Ontario regulations. And so these federal regulations make it impossible to import into Canada equipment that doesn't meet US EPA requirements. So the difficulty is one wouldn't be able to import into Canada. Once those products are imported into Canada, they wouldn't meet the Ontario regulations. And it is technically very difficult to take two emission control devices. Picture putting two catalytic converters on your car. The car probably wouldn't work very well because the engine couldn't support the back pressure. It wouldn't be able to breathe properly. And of course, engines, like humans, need to be able to breathe properly. And so that's the difficulty. You couldn't import a product into Canada unless it met the federal standards, which are based on US EPA. And once it gets here, it's very difficult and likely impossible to upgrade that particular engine to meet Ontario standards. I just wanted to mention as well as one might have a takeaway from this that perhaps the Ontario standards are too strict. And that's not the case. What we've seen is Ontario in 2011 was a leader, but many other jurisdictions across North America have now followed those Ontario standards. And that's also created a market for us in the US. So if we look at leading jurisdictions like Massachusetts, like California, like Utah, they all have very similar standards to these Ontario standards, which so it's not like Ontario has put in place something which is, let's call it, an unreasonable air quality requirement. Quite the contrary.
Well, Bob, you know what? Since you've raised this with me, I took this to the House of Commons. As a member of Parliament, it's my job to hold the government of the day. In this case, this would be Minister Wilkinson, who is the Minister for the Environment and Climate Change. He's someone that I have a tremendous amount of respect for, but one of the things he's continued to tout is his credentials as having come from clean tech. So why don't we just take a moment here and we'll just review how the exchange went on the concern raised about these regulations in the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, Safety Power is a great Canadian company that creates world-class clean tech to remove nitrous oxides from generators. We should be celebrating this homegrown technology, yet the government is about to put in new regulations gazetted on March 9th, 2019, that will literally shutter their operations here in Canada, driving away the very clean tech that Liberals like to say they support. Why is this government refusing to listen to companies like Safety Power and stop these job-killing regulations?
Honourable Minister. The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the question. Certainly, Canadian clean tech is an important part of a broad approach to addressing the climate issue, and Canada is very fortunate that the investments that have been made over the course of the past 5 years have resulted in Canadian clean tech leading the world. Over the last couple of years, Canada has had between 11 and 12 companies listed on the top 100 clean tech companies in the world. We are very, very committed to working with the clean tech sector to ensure that they can grow and thrive.
Well, Bob, we're back. What were your thoughts running through your mind when you saw the minister respond to my question about your company?
Well, first of all, we're very grateful that the question was raised. I guess the outcome that we've seen, and I think the minister does not want to harm Canadian initiatives. I think this is just a kind of a unfortunate byproduct, and I think kind of reflects at least from our perspective, there's a huge alignment between having good regulation that can actually enable job creation, can enable clean tech opportunities for Canadians, and the fantastic educational systems that we have. And what we've seen here is really not much consideration, unfortunately, for that alignment between clean tech opportunities for Canadians and clean air. And I guess since you raised the question, we have had engagement with ministry officials. We're grateful for that. I think they really do want to work with us. Unfortunately, the new regulation comes into play on June 4th of this year, and we don't really have a guideline in terms of a pathway to be able to accommodate the federal regulation in that time frame. And so at the end of the day, I guess what we're seeing is the spirit is willing, but unfortunately, the actual impact on our business and the cluster that we're associated with is there really is no relief at this particular point in time, unfortunately.
So there's no path yet you've seen. I'm glad to hear that the officials at least reached out to you. But what happens on June 4th?
Well, it's actually already happened. So we have, because of course customers are aware that the regulation is coming. I can't mention the name of the company, but it's a very large automotive company with very large manufacturing facilities in Ontario. That was a customer that we had been working with together with one of our engine partners, and it was business that had been won. And if effectively June 4th, if the engine that is coming from the United States cannot be stamped with a June 3rd or earlier date, which now appears unlikely, that business will be lost. And that's the first of many losses that will occur for companies like ours in the Canadian market. And so, that is going to trigger, more losses. And, from our standpoint, the difficulty that we face, we also have the U.S. is a major market for us. There's also, a Buy American initiative. It really means that Robert Denoy, my business partner, and I need to look at aspects of our business that are perhaps, better located in the U.S., in particularly the manufacturing side of things, because it's just difficult for us to be domiciled in a country that doesn't want our equipment.
Bob, I'm sorry to hear that you and Robert are stuck in this position. I want to see the innovation and the employment that you've brought to your region and to this country maintained, and in fact, to see it go up. So the fact that these new regulations are going to curtail that, and the fact that they just don't seem to be oriented to the kind of on-the-ground reality that a business like yours faces. I think it's really bad, and I really do think the government, and again, this government always likes to use the term, better is always possible. I will do whatever I can to push the minister, to push his government to recognize the significant impacts that its own regulations are going to have, and to get a better outcome here. So thank you very much for sharing some of your time with us today. I know that as a business person, it's always tough to take time away from doing what you do best. And I'm sorry that it's because of this. But we will continue to push in Ottawa and to see where we can get those smart regulations that make for better outcomes for everyone.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.